What's up guys? Welcome back to the channel Hand Waving. Your friend Naruto Addict 2.0 is here again with a brand new Naruto fanfic that's going to change everything. A story where Naruto is betrayed and banished. But destiny has bigger plans for him. From exile to emperor, this is the journey of power, strategy, and love. Today's fanfic is titled, which is what if Naruto rose from the full night of the Kyuubi to build a legendary 18+ harem, Part 1. A deal struck. On a late October day, a crack of sunlight peered its way through a shade-covered window set within the stone walls of an imposing tower that stood at the center of a bustling village lit by the orange glow of a fall sun as it sank across the horizon. As that last trails of light pushed through the window, they fell upon a blond man relaxed in his chair facing a worn wooden desk, his body lax as he looked out towards his dimly lit office. As the light traveled across the worn wood of the desk, skipping over unopened scrolls and the discarded bits of quill and paper, it came to rest glinting slightly on a pair of china saucers and a photo that sat before them as if the frame itself was to enjoy their presence. Even as the light dimmed, the last vestiges of it glinted upon the frame housing the image of an old smiling man staring out defiantly from the glass, holding a peace sign as he flashed his eternal smile to the blonde before him. Sitting across from the still image, the blonde man remained motionless as his eyes drifted across the photo, his mind casting into the stream of his memory as he found a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Flashback. Minato, my boy, that hat sure suits you. Chuckled an elderly man draped in a set of older white robes, his crinkled face turning up in a smile, as he watched his successor place the Hokage hat upon his head and take his first seat behind what had long been his own desk. Of course it does, sensei. Can I teach them or what? Laughed a white-haired man dressed like a kabuki actor, swelling with pride at seeing his student succeed in his dream thanks to his guidance. Well, I did some of the work, Jiraiya-sensei. Chuckled the blond man as he adjusted the brim of the hat now sitting atop his head so that the red emblem of fire faced towards the pair before him. As the three men chuckled, Minato could not help but smile back at his own inauguration a few hours before as he took his first sit in the Hokage office with his predecessor and sensei looking over him. The blonde Hokage simply sat smiling at the two, basking in the realization that at long last he had accomplished the dream he had held since childhood. Turning his head slightly, he set his gaze out over the village resting below his new perch, his village. As he looked out, he felt a small pressure on his chest as his eyes tracked out over his home, pride, hope, and most of all love, fighting for dominance as he looked upon the scattered rooftops and the small moving shapes that made of the people he had sworn to protect. Then and there he swore to himself that he would follow in the footsteps of the other Hokage and protect his home from any danger, no matter the cost to himself. As Minato gazed out on the village, the third Hokage watched his successor, a small smile upon his lips as he felt a growing pride at the man who would be carrying on his duty from that day on. Sighing to himself, the third cast his mind back over his time in the office. He had carried the village through the slog of war, the glory of victory, and the simply calm of peace, but now, at long last, he was passing on the will of fire to the next generation. A small tear formed on the corners of his eyes as he saw himself all those long years ago first taking the Hokage hat, the look of pride on his sensei's face at the time, even as his own lit up smiling just as Minato's did now. And at long last it was his turn to watch the torch pass on. Turning slightly, he looked at his student, the Toad Sage, and couldn't help but chuckle at the expression playing across the man's face. Jiraiya had never been one for sultry, so while the old third and new fourth Hokage allowed this moment to wash over them with small warm expression, Jiraiya had elected to sport a pair of waterfalls that fell from both eyes, muttering how proud he was that his student had made it this far, his words barely audible as he tried to rub away his tear with one red sleeve. I always sniff. Knew you had it in you, you blonde gaki. Sniff. The old sage managed between his continued happy sobs. Turning around at the sound, Minato could not help but burst into a wide grin looking at his old sensei's expression, rising from his chair as he made his way slowly towards the man. Come on, Ero-sensei, this isn't a time to be crying. Wouldn't want all those beautiful women to see the gallant Jiraiya in such a state, would we? chuckled Minato as he clapped a hand upon the sage's back, causing him to halt his sobbing for a moment. This seemed to snap Jiraiya out of his stoop as he blinked up at Minato for a moment before smiling widely before striking a triumphant pose in the center of the office. You're right, Gaki. I, Jiraiya the gallant toad sage, am now the teacher of the fourth and soon-to-be greatest Hokage the leaf has ever known. The ladies won't be able to resist me, shouted the white-haired man even as a perverted smile spread across his face. At the sight of Jiraiya's perverted smile, Minato and Sarutobi could only shake their heads before as Minato slung his arm around Jiraiya's shoulder, smiling so brightly his face seemed to glow. Well, come on then, Ero-sensei, I have a date with the most beautiful girl in the village, and it's a time of celebration. The blonde laughed as he glanced around to the other member of the trio. You coming, Sarutobi? Called Minato as he and Jiraiya moved slowly towards the door, the blonde glancing back to see the third standing silently before the old desk, one hand lying upon the worn wood while looking into the photos of the previous Hokages that hung above the window with a small smile upon his lips as he traced each image. As he turned to face the two men, his smile slowly grew to match the pair's own as he looked upon the future of his village with pride. Yes, Minato, I'm coming. I wouldn't want to keep Kushina and my wife waiting, replied the third as he turned from the desk, starting forwards towards the pair only to stop dead as he came to a sudden realization. The other two noticed this change and stopped their merry-making to gaze questioningly at the third, who had gone completely rigid. Hey old man, sensei, are you alright? They questioned in unison as they looked at the seemingly frozen man. As they watched, the smile Sarutobi had adopted grew steadily larger and larger, until it appeared to cover his whole face. As Minato and Jiraiya watched, they would have sworn that a younger man had been standing in the office that day, so full of life and happiness was Sarutobi as a glorious thought took root in his mind. Then, without warning, the old man bursting into the loudest and happiest laugh that the two had ever heard from him, the sound echoing around the office, seeming to only grow louder every moment as it ricocheted off of every surface. No. Ha 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 ha. Pap. Pa. Pa. Free ha 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 ha. I ha 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 ha, I'm free, laughed the old man as he threw up his hands as thought he was proclaiming to the heavens themselves of his great victory. Sensei, did Sarutobi just go crazy? Questioned Minato, glancing around to his sensei, who looked just as lost as his student at the old man's apparent breakdown. I have no idea, Gaki, responded Jiraiya as he continued to watch his sensei cheer for a moment longer. Hey sensei, snap out of it, shouted Jiraiya as he waved towards the man who didn't seem to notice him. For a full minute afterwards, the third continued to laugh, barely able to speak, only sputtering the occasional word out here and there as the pair looked only completely lost as to the cause of this episode. It kind of sounded like he said, "No more paperwork," but why would he say that? Asked Minato after a few moments of listening to the old man's howling. At this, both turned to each other before remembering all of the years they had watched the third wage his seemingly unending war against what he had always said was his greatest foe. Then, as the pieces fell into place, the pair found themselves joining in the laughter themselves, at the old man's last victory as Hokage. Yes, the third Hokage student of the first and second had finally surpassed his predecessors in outlasting the evil that was paperwork. For a time the three continued to laugh and joke before finally gaining enough control to head out to the celebration. But not before Minato had insisted on the photo to commemorate Sarutobi's greatest victory. Flashback end. So 2 years after that happy memory, Minato sat alone in his office, his eyes tracing across the photo he had insisted on taking that day, dropping his gaze slowly to the sake dishes sat between him and the smiling face of Sarutobi. Looking at the old photo, he could only think how happy they had all been then, remembering how Kushina had hit him over the head when the three arrived late, and how Jiraiya had been thrown through a wall by Tsunade when he had tried to flirt with the waitress. It seemed like so long ago now. If only those days could have continued on, but as his memories continued swim slowly past him, those bright days slowly shifted till arriving at the darkest night of his life. Flashback. That night under the mid-October moon, Minato found himself standing beside his wife within a hidden cave, lit only by the fiery illumination of touchlight that they were using to safeguard the birth of their children. Covering the walls and table were a practical sea of seals meant to hold the beast that dwelt within the woman at bay as she gave life to the struggling forms still nestled within her belly. Though at the moment Kushina was quite intent on ridding herself of that particular burden. "Minato, I'm going to kill you for doing this to me," screamed Kushina as she continued to contract, her face grimacing as flashes of pain flashed across her sweating brow. "Come on honey, you're almost there, you'll be fine," whimpered Minato even as the bones in his hand cracked under the redhead's grip, his face turned up in worry at the sight of his wife in pain before him. "Don't you honey me Mr. Hokage, I better get all the ramen for this," she screamed out again as the contractions picked up, cutting her words off to be replaced by her labored breathing. The absurdity of the last comment causing Minato to momentarily sweat drop. Only his wife could be thinking of ramen at a time like this. However, before the blonde could give further thought to the matter, his attention was turned around as Sarutobi's wife moved forwards to help receive the first child that was slowly pushing out at that very moment. The birthing was longer than he would have thought possible as each child came one by one, but after what seemed like an eternity, Minato was looking down at three beautiful faces all scrunched up and crying. As he looked down at his newborn children, tears found themselves spilling from his eyes, as he waked over with the third's wife, holding the children up for Kushina to see, her own face still stretched with exhaustion lit up in a beautiful smile as she gazed upon her children's small forms. Even as Kushina slowly reached out towards her children's small forms, Minato moved forwards to aid in holding the demon sealed within Kushina at bay, lest the great nine-tailed kitsune seize the opportunity to escape its prison. That moment of relief was when everything had gone so terribly wrong. As Minato had moved forwards, a man in a spiral mask had appeared seemingly from nowhere, slaying Sarutobi's wife with a single slash, spattering the stone floor with a crimson stain as he reached out to seize the still sobbing bundles of his daughters from her quickly cooling corpse. Even as Bawako's body fell, the man had swung his still bloodied kunai to the baby's throats and demanded Kushina's life in exchange. Minato had engaged the man in a desperate battle, and had managed to save his newborn children, but at a cost. The man had managed to tear the demon from his wife as they battled. The Kyuubi had been released and was now attacking the village, his village. On the front lines, ninjas desperately tried to hold the beast at bay, throwing their lives towards the kitsune in a desperate hope to buy a few more precious moments for their loved ones to escape the demon's wrath. Meanwhile, within a secluded safe house, Minato had managed to retrieve Kushina was now leaning over his wife as he gazed out the window, even as the distant sounds of carnage steadily drawing nearer. As his eyes trailed down to his new family, he felt an odd calm wash over him as he prepared himself for what he knew was his duty. He could not let the beast take them, he would not let it take his village, and he would never let it take anything from him while he still drew breath. "Minato," Kushina whispered as she gazed up into her husband's face, even as he said it into a look of determination, the fear in her voice noticeable even through the pain and exhaustion that racked her body after having the beast torn from her. "Minato," she managed again, drawing the blonde's eyes to her as she struggled to speak. What are we going to do? The Kyuubi, we can't let it hurt them," she whispered, her voice fading slightly as she clutched her three babies closer to her bosom, each letting out small whimpers as the distant roar of the Kyuubi rumbled across the land. "Don't worry, Kushina, I won't let it hurt them, I promise," he whispered. He slowly moved towards her, his tone setting of small warning bells within her mind, even as she felt Minato's lips upon her forehead, and his hands pulling the three bundles from her arms as he rose. "What are yo?" was all she was able to say as he disappeared in a yellow flash, leaving her alone, her arms now empty as she felt a growing horror building in her chest. "Minato," she called as the realization of what he was doing, and what it would cost, began to set in for her, even as her voice rose what strength she can, pushing out in a cry of fear for the lives of her loved ones. No, Minato, not them, not you, no. She screamed, even as her husband raced towards his death. A moment after his departure from his wife, Minato arrived on the battlefield, within a flash of yellow light, landing beside his old sensei and the third, both panting from their continued attempts to hold back the Kyuubi. Minato! They shouted as the blonde arrived. Their eyes immediately drawn to the three struggling bundles he had clutched against his chest before shifting back to the young Hokage, confusion evident upon their faces. Gaki, what are you doing bringing them here? This isn't a good time for bring your kids to work day. The Toad Sage joked, called, taking a second to crack a joke despite the desperate situation. Not replying to his sensei's jib, Minato turned to face the two, his gaze telling them in a moment that he stood ready to make the ultimate sacrifice that night. At this realization, both suddenly felt like bucket of ice water had been dumped down their backs as their thoughts came to settle on the only reason for the children's presence, and the haunted look now evident upon the blonde's brow. The Fuinjustu, Shiki Fujin, they both thought at the same time. Gaki, no, you can't do this, yelled Jiraiya, taking a step towards the fourth, desperate to talk his student out of this. I'm sorry, sensei, but it's the only way. If I do this, at least the fox won't be able to take anything else from me, and they, at this point he looked down upon the faces of his children, a soft smile touching his lips, at least they will be safe, he finished in a determined tone. No, Gaki, there has to be another way, we can think of something, we just need a little time, pleaded the Toad Sage. Time, growled Minato as he turned to his sensei. Time is something we don't have. Every second is being paid with by the blood of our village, my village. If my death can stop that flow, I will jump into the jaws of the Shinigami himself. Minato shouted back, his voice causing the babes in his arms to suddenly begin to struggle slightly against his chest as the little face of his son let out another loud cry. Jiraiya, spoke the third, cutting off the sage's retort before it could begin. He is right, whispered the third, his words causing the sage to spin around to face him, looking horrified at his old sensei's words. This is what it means to be Hokage, this is what it means to be prepared to give your life for the sake of the village, and this is why Minato was the right choice for Hokage, continued the third as he slowly approached Minato even as the roar of the Kyuubi drew steadily closer. But sensei, managed the white-haired man as he watched the aged Hokage pass him by as he slowly moved to stand before Minato. As Sarutobi approached, Minato found his eyes drifting down to the crying face of his son as he raised one hand to lightly caress the boy's cheek in an attempt to quiet him, silently thanking the third for understanding what had to be done as he looked upon his children for what could be his last time. That moment, however, was all the aged man needed as he disappeared in a burst of speed, appearing behind the young Hokage, and with a swift chop to the neck, rendered him unconscious. Before Minato's body had reached the forest floor, Sarutobi had moved yet again, gathering the three children in his arms and turned to his student, who looked on in shock. Jiraiya, the third shouted, causing the Toad Sage to turn away from his fallen student to his teacher. Look after the Hokage, and, here he paused, his eyes drifting slowly across the treetops to where the barest hint of the village could be made out, illuminated in the raging flames around it. Look after the village for an old man, will you? He finished, a look of peace overcoming his face as he watched his student looking unbelieving at him. But sensei, you can't. Jiraiya began, only to fall silent as Sarutobi shook his head slightly, the ghost of the sensei he had been seeming to fall around him as he lectured his student for one last time. Jiraiya, I told you a long time ago what it meant to be a shinobi of Konoha. The old man said, looking back at Jiraiya with that same look of peace upon his face as he slowly turned away from his student. Besides, the third called, cracking a small smile as he continued, I think beating both paperwork and the Kyuubi will make me welcome when I see my senseis tonight. After all, I can't keep Bawako waiting for me. Finished the old man with a smile even as he vanished towards the raging Kyuubi, leaving the pair alone in the clearing as the roars of the Kyuubi thundered across the land, the drums to the final march of a true shinobi. Jiraiya could only fall to his knees, looking down at the form of his student lying unconscious before him. Even as the roaring of the Kyuubi grew and Jiraiya heard and saw the explosions and seal arrays that signaled the final battle of his teacher, he could only remember back to his first days as a student with the third. CS. Sensei, what the idea of the will of fire that you keep talking about? Asked a young Jiraiya as he sat tied to training post blinking up towards where his sensei stood looking down at him. Pushing what strength remained in his aged form, Sarutobi dashed forward, breaking out of the forest edge as he turned to face the rampaging Kyuubi, a blast of smoke obscuring him for a moment before his oldest partner, the great monkey king Enma, was falling into step beside him. As the two rushed ahead, another blast of smoke erupted before the charging man was suddenly amongst a field of identical figures, all now sporting great staffs that they lowered to face the great kitsune that swiveled to face them. The will of fire. Well, that is something my senseis passed down to me when I became a shinobi of this village. Honestly, what do they teach you kids in the academy these days? Replied Sarutobi, putting on hand to his chin as his eyes drifted momentarily from the bound boy, who looked annoyed at being suddenly ignored. With a monstrous roar, the massive kitsune rushed towards the approaching storm of Sarutobi's enormous claws, fangs and tails coming to bear upon the army before him that answer his roar with one of their own, a last valiant battle cry that echoed out through the night as the elements themselves hurtled one after another, covering the skies in flashes of flame and electricity beside the dull force of water and earth, all cast against the beast's ferocity. Well, how to put this? You see, the will of fire is what makes us able to protect those we care about. It's that strength that only comes when defending those you care for. It's because I care about the people of the village that I'm able to protect them all. They are my strength. Smiled the third as Jiraiya blinked up at him, obviously confused. As the storm of elements crashed upon the great kitsune, the beast seemed to ignore them as it barreled ahead, roaring as it swiped its massive tails back and forth, scattering all that came into contact with them, even as its claws and fangs tore still more of the army before it. At the same time, Sarutobi turned to four of his clones, handing off the three children, trusting them to handle the ritual as he turned to buy them what time he could. But sensei, how does that make you strong? I mean, aren't we just paid to protect people? Besides, everyone protects their home. What makes us different? Questioned the boy, obviously lost, as above him Sarutobi let out a small chuckle, shaking his head from side to side. Sarutobi hurled himself aside as the massive jaws of the Kyuubi snapped down towards him, swinging the massive bow staff, that was his partner, into the beast's jaw even as its tails lashed towards him. Swiveling its enraged eyes to focus on the source of this new Kyuubi brought one massive paw around, claws bared, to smash this incest that dare oppose him flat. Just as Sarutobi managed to avoid another crushing tail of the beast, a shadow fell over him, causing him to spin in time to see a paw, the size of a building, descending upon him. The next moment, with an earth-shaking impact, the Kyuubi felt its paw crushing into the forest floor as a fierce grin to spread across its face. That is true, Gaki. Sometimes we are simply hired to do jobs for others, but let me ask you this, if you're out on a mission, won't you be with your team? Smiled the third, causing the boy to look up at his sensei before nodding slowly as the old man smiled. You see, our home isn't just this village, Gaki, it's the people, our comrades. As long as you are a member of this village, you will always be with the will of fire. Smiled the third as the young boy blinked up at him, still looking puzzled at the old man's words. Before the great kitsune could celebrate smashing the annoying fly, his smile faltered as a sudden pain erupted from his paw. A moment before, the end of one massive bow staff burst through its fur, rocketing skywards through his very paw, staking it to the ground. As the staff continued to rise, the enraged kitsune's eyes turned up to spot the accursed man running up its side, going through hand signs as he went. Upon becoming level with the Kyuubi's face, the man sprung from the pole towards the beast's face, even as it brought its other paw to swat the pole from its paw. You see, Jiraiya, as long as we have people to protect, we have the will of fire, and by protecting them they inherit that will and carry it to the next generation, so our flame will always be passed down. Smiled the old man. Itsutsu Ryu Arashid bellowed the third as he became level with the kitsune's head, spitting out streams of earth, fire, wind, water, and thunder towards the beast. Each of the steams forming into a separate dragon which crashed into the beast, slamming it into the ground, even as those remaining shadow clones began to slam bow staffs through the beast's tails, desperate to hold it for even a moment longer. Meanwhile, across the field, the 4 clones had finished the preparations as the 3 children clung together on a small shrine as around them the clones began flying through the hand signs to call forth the ritual. "Filthy ape!" roared the Kyuubi as it struggled against its new bindings. "You think you can hold me?" spat the kitsune as its tails began to rip the bow staffs away from its body, the remaining clones falling one by one as the beast freed itself. "I burn you village to ash, and use its people to kindle the thirst of my vengeance, monkey!" roared the Kyuubi as it continued to surge forwards. However, the third was not listening to the beast. He had used the momentary opening to rush to the ceiling altar to complete the ritual. Skidding in front of the altar, he suddenly found his legs weakening as he fell to his knees, coughing up blood as he did. "Guess this old body of mine just isn't going to be enough for much longer," managed Sarutobi as he looked back to the Kyuubi even as it began to break free from its cage. As the clones finished their work, a sudden cold power radiated across the clearing as the Shinigami himself appeared, glowing faintly in all his horrible magnificence, dropping to hover slightly behind the aged Hokage. At the same moment, the seals around the altar began to glow, attracting the attention of the Kyuubi, and unbeknownst to those present, something else that looked on from the heavens. "And even if we lose someone important to us, their death sparks a light for others to protect those who care about one another. That is the will of fire," finished the third as he looked down at his student, who still didn't look convinced. As the kitsune watched, a ghostly hand suddenly emerged from the old man, plunging into his being as pain the likes of which he had never known slowly ripped him apart, his roars echoing out across the forest. As the broken parts of the Kyuubi were pulled towards the infants by the Shinigami, a swirling seal appeared on 2 of the children as each began to absorb the Kyuubi, the beast slowly drawn into each. Even as the last bits of the fox began to fade into the 2 little girls, Sarutobi noticed a small seal appearing on the only boy of the 3, a seal he did not create. As his vision blurred, he saw a small tree-like tattoo appear for a moment on the boy's forehead, before fading. The time for wondering, however, was over. His time was over. Looking back towards the village, he could just make out the faces on the Hokage monument even as the light of his eyes began to fade. "So Jiraiya, does that make sense now?" asked Sarutobi as he bent to untie the boy from the training pole. And with a smile on his face, Sarutobi, the 3rd Hokage, the professor god of shinobi, knelt down at the scene of his greatest victory, smiling towards the village he loved, and the faces of his masters he knew he had pleased. "I still don't quite get it," replied Jiraiya, a shrug causing his sensei to chuckle slightly to himself. "Well, that's okay, Gaki, you'll understand someday," smiled the 3rd. CS. And as the kitsune slowly faded from sight, Jiraiya sat kneeling before his student, his eyes fixed upon the horizon where his sensei's final lesson had finally managed to pound its way through his thick skull, his mouth twitching up in a smile even as tears began to spill from his eyes at the knowledge of what this final lesson had cost his sensei. Flashback end. As Minato remembered that night, his thoughts turned to his own part, how he had awakened only in time to help find Sarutobi already dead, his children beside the man on an altar, 2 having the Shinigami's seal still glowing slightly upon them as the 3 had moved to hold tight to one another, trying to stay warm in the cool night air. Minato couldn't help but smile, remembering how Kushina had first burst into happy tears when he had returned with all 3 of their children, and then proceeded to beat him into the ground while crying, yelling about worrying her so much. He chuckled, remembering that following this Kushina had collapsed on him, crying into his shirt and telling him never to leave her like that again. The days following the attack had been tough for the village. Besides the physical damage, the spirit itself had been wounded with the loss of so many. The dead were located and honored. A massive ceremony was held to honor both them and the 3rd for their sacrifice to the village. Minato had announced to the council that his 2 daughters had become the new Jinchuriki for the Kyuubi, explaining the events of that night. While somewhere at first scared of the children, Minato's assurances finally won the council over and his daughters were celebrated as heroes for helping the third to save them from the raging kitsune. Shaking himself from these memories, Minato's gaze slowly returned to the photo before him as he let out a small sigh. Smiling slightly, Minato raised his hand to cup one of the sake dishes, raising it towards the photo of the third's, offering another thank you to the man, who 1 year ago to this day had saved both his family and his village. After finishing the drink, Minato proceeded home to celebrate along with his family the life they had been given this day. Time skip. We return to the Leaf Village some 4 years later. During this time the village had been able to rebuild itself from the Kyuubi attack, and was well on its way towards a complete restoration. The memories of that horrible night slowly fading into history as Konoha marched into its future. Meanwhile, in the Namikaze home, most of the family was happily preparing for dinner, or at least attempting to. Naruto Namikaze, the oldest and only son, was bouncing up and down in his chair, excited for his dad to get home, barely able to contain his excitement as he looked around the room as if expecting the man to pop out from under one of the chairs scattered around the large circular table that served as the centerpiece to the kitchen. The young child's grinning face was just like his mother's, but everything else was a complete mix of his parents'. His eyes were a blind of both the violet of his mother and the azure blue of his father, so that they carried a look not unlike a sea at sunset. Meanwhile, his hair had chosen a bright blonde mop just like his dad's. As he looked around, his blended eyes meet the bright blue of the second oldest child that stood opposite him. Naruto also bouncing around awaiting the return of their father, her blonde hair waving behind her pulled back into a single ponytail that draped down the side of her head, while her blue eyes darted around just as her brother's did, a wide smile playing across her whiskered face which carried the same smooth curves of her mother's, and her personality happened to be similar as well. As the two children continued to bounce excitedly, their matching red and white Uzumaki shirts waving around them, their constant movement drew the attention of the final child. Standing over by the skink, the youngest of the triplets, Minami stood in stark contrast to the other two, starting with her fiery red hair that was drawn back so that it cascaded down her back, becoming two pigtails mirrored after her godmother Tsunade. Her eyes as well were different, carrying a deep red, almost brown color that gave her a powerful presence, exemplified by her slightly sharper face like that of her father. Unlike her two siblings, she was offering help to their mother, while every once in a while looking at her siblings with a sad little smile and a shake of her head as though she was looking at much younger children instead of her older siblings. Meanwhile, the three's mother Kushina was currently standing over an oven working to get their dinner ready for when Minato arrived, a happy smile upon her lips as she listened to the excited chatter of her children. The previous Jinchuriki had not changed much over the past 5 years, still easily identified by her long red hair, her round happy face and warm violet eyes. Thanks to the timely arrival of Tsunade, she had recovered from the events 5 years ago, and had been able to look after her family ever since. At present she was dressed in a simply green and white dress that allowed for her protruding belly to be accommodated. It seemed, despite her statements that Knight Kushina had not been too opposed to bringing another little one into the world, and at present her family couldn't be more excited to meet its newest member. "Here you go, Minami, put these on the table for me," Kushina said as she handed a few plates to her daughter, who turned up to her mother, red eyes meeting violet as she nodded. "Hi, Kasen," smiled Minami, taking the dish from the taller redhead and turning to face her siblings still bouncing up and down at the table. "You know," she called towards the pair, momentarily drawing their attention to their Imoto, "you two could help Kasen and me with dinner, it's not like you're doing anything," finished the redhead as she marched over towards the table. As she moved, the two blondes turned towards their Imoto, both sporting fox grins, and jumped up to help her out. From behind them, Kushina could only look on as the children started to set the table, idly placing on hand lovingly over her belly and the new life within it. When Minato had first told her that her two daughters were holding the fox, she had been horribly worried about how the village would react, but thanks to her husband, most had seen them for the heroes they were. Meanwhile, her fists had convinced those foolish enough not to listen to think twice before messing with her family. She also remembered back to the time that they had told the girls that they contained the fox 1 year ago. Oh 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 Flashback. Now girls, there's something. Naruto, get off Naruto. Called Minato as he attempted to speak to his children while them seemed intent on their own activities. The three children had been engaged in a poking battle while they sat on the couch facing their parents, and Naruto had finally abandoned subtlety and tackled her older triplet over the back of the couch moments before, just as their father began to speak to them. Meanwhile, Minami was rolling around giggling at the whole thing, her tiny hands clasped over her mouth as she tried and failed to stifle her giggles. A moment later, the two blondes emerged from the back of the couch grinning and laughing at their red-faced father, while their mother giggled off to the side at her husband's failed attempts to control their children. Receiving nothing but laughter for his efforts, Minato looked pleadingly at his wife for help with the situation. Okay, you two, front and center, we have something important to say. You can play later. Called Kushina, finally taking pity on her husband's attempts and deciding to handle her children. Hi Kasen. The three trumpeted in unison, suddenly sitting straight up on the couch once more, silently waiting for their parents to continue. For a moment, Minato could only blink from his wife to his three kids with a look of shock upon his face, wondering how she could do that so easily before deciding better of it. Ahem. Anyway, there is something important we need to tell Naruto and Minami today, and Naruto, you need to know too, began Minato as the three listened eagerly. The two parents then proceeded to tell the three children how the Kyuubi had attacked, how the three had been taken to be sealed, and how Naruto and Minami become the next Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi just like their mother before them. After they had finished their story, the pair of children sat silently looking between their parents', horror slowly creeping their faces. Seeing fear upon their daughters' faces, both Minato and Kushina started to assure the two girls that everything would be alright, but their son beat them to it. So you two have a big fox in you tummies, that's so cool. How does that feel? Is it fuzzy? Where can I get one? Naruto called excitedly, fired off question after question while poking both of his sisters' stomachs, unintentionally tickling them. Nah Naruto, hihiha. Stop that, it dehiha tickles. Laughed Minima. She tried to get her brother to stop, the tears that had begun to form out of fear and sadness turning to happiness before she could even let them fall. Hihei Onichan, hehaha, no fair, stop that. Laughed Naruto, who like her sister had her mind shift from sadness to happiness due to her brother's assault, her hands trying and failing to batter his away as he continued to poke at both of the girls, drawing fresh giggles from their lips. But why? You said you have a fox in your tummy, so I'm just petting him, maybe he's ticklish too. Smiled Naruto while continuing to play with the two sisters, each glancing at each other through their laughter before smiling back at their brother and tackling him to the floor, intent on paying him back, with cries of fox power, and for the fluffy one ringing out amongst the children's laughter. In the end, the serious discussion of the daughter's burden culminated in three children, two blonde and one redhead, rolling around before their parents laughing and playing, the fears of what they had learned banished before they be given life. Meanwhile, both Minato and Kushina looked on happily at their children, silently thanking their little maelstrom for protecting his sisters from their own doubts. Well, Kushina-chan, I don't think we have to worry about them feeling bad as long as Naruto is around. Smiled Minato as Kushina nodded to him, her own thoughts, remembering the words of her predecessor Mito, and knowing that within this family they would always find the love they needed to hold strong to their burden. Flashback end. Just as Kushina allowed her memories to fade, Minato entered into the kitchen only to be bowled over by two blonde missiles that tackled him to the floor, with ear-to-ear smiles, and cries of, "To-san." As she watched Minato disentangled himself from the two with help from Minami, who always seemed the more adult of the trio, and helped her father to his feet. Well, how my favorite family is today? Asked Minato as he walked over to Kushina, planting a kiss on her cheek as he did so. Your family is fine, dear. We were all just getting dinner ready before the party tonight, isn't that right, kids? Kushina said, smiling down at the three. Hi. Called the three, smiles covering all three of their faces. Well, that's great, guys. Replied Minato as he moved to help Kushina with the meal, fussing over her to the point she had to swat him with her ladle just to get him to calm down. After dinner, the group proceeded to get dressed for the arrival of their guests for the party, before they headed out to the Kyuubi celebration. Once they were all down in the living room again, Minato called his family forward to make a quick announcement before the guest arrived. Now Minami, Naruto, I have talked to your cousin and we have decided that we need to begin you training a little early, so that we can get you guys ready for the academy next year, he said, smiling down at his girls. Both girls smiled brightly at this, Naruto even jumping up and down saying how awesome it was going to be become a kunoichi as they looked excitedly towards their parents. However, both stopped a moment later when they realized that their brother wasn't celebrating. Naruto was looking between his sisters and his parents, wondering why he hadn't been mentioned, his little face turning towards Minato, confusion evident upon his face. Anyo, Tusen, spoke Naruto, prompting Minato to turn towards his son. Am I going to start my training with Naruto-chan and Minami-chan? Questioned Naruto as his Imotos soon turned to look from their brother to Minato, in turn just as confused as the blonde boy. Well, you see, Naruto-kun, your sisters need to learn to control the fox so they will be safe as kunoichi in the academy, but once they have gotten the hang of it you can join in training, but for right now we have to make sure they are safe. I know it's hard, but for right now we have to work with the girls a little more. Spoke Minato, kneeling down so that he was closer to his son, his face an odd mix of sadness and determination that was lost to the young child. His Tusen's words caused Naruto to turn towards his two sisters, who were watching him with worried expressions, as though they were scared he was going to blame them for this, and worse, that they would be leaving him behind. From the time they were kids they had always been inseparable, and the idea of leaving Naruto to fend for himself sounded wrong to them. As Naruto saw the pair's expression slowly shifting, he realized they were worried about him, and thought back to what his Tusen just told him. He did want to train with his sisters, but he remembered hearing from Kushina once that training with the Kyuubi had been hard for her. That must be what this was, so if he wanted his two sisters to be okay when they entered into the academy he'd have to wait a bit. Well, that was okay, wasn't it? And besides, it wasn't like his parents were going to not train him, they just needed to look after his sisters first, that was all, he reassured himself as he nodded towards Minato. Okay Tusen, I understand, replied the blonde boy, smiling as he turned to face his sisters. You two better train hard, or when I join I'll leave you in the dust. Boosted Naruto, smiling as he saw the pair shift from concern to happiness at his assurance. Oh yeah, well, I'm going to train so hard, I'll be Hokage like Tusen before your training starts. Shot back Naruto, not one to back down from a challenge, as a confident smile split across her face. Yeah, we will be so great you be begging us to teach you what we know. Added Minami, inwardly happy that her brother was going to be okay, and promising to be strong enough to help him like he helped her at learning about her burden. Okay kids, it's about time for the guest to show up, called Kushina, getting the three to separate and calm down in time to greet their guests. Time skip. It was now almost a year later and the triplets had just turned 6 a few days ago, while their newest little sister Mito was just turning 1. The three had changed little during the year in manner of looks. Meanwhile, their new little sister had been growing quickly into a little bundle of energy that the whole family adored. Little Mito, with bright red hair and violet eyes, was like a little Kushina in the making, and her bubbly excitement was partially infectious to anyone who met her. Over the years since the birth, Minato and Kushina had been training Naruto and Minami to harness and control the Kyuubi chakra, making steady progress as they worked with the pair. Minato had even called Jiraiya to stop by and help train the two whenever he was free. As a result, the two sisters had begun to blossom as future kunoichi, each determined to make their family proud. Speaking of family, one of their instructors usually sported a little redheaded babe at most of their sessions. Following the birth, Kushina was often found with Mito in her arms, instructing the two while she watched them practice. Meanwhile, the children's godmother Tsunade was busy most of the time with the medical program she had pushed through after the Kyuubi event, but still found time to stop by and spoil her goddaughters rotten and patch them up when they managed to bang themselves up like children are wont to do. Sadly, even as Minami and Naruto grew steadily closer to their family, their brother was slowly fading from that same light. Naruto found himself being left out little by little from family activates, slowly being overshadowed by those around him as his sisters drew more and more attention. After the birth of Mito, his parents tended to stress their attention between his sisters' training and looking after their newest little member, leaving little time for him. Meanwhile, those outside of the family like Jiraiya, while kind to Naruto but only present every now and then, and for some reason that Naruto didn't understand, seemed to focus only his twin sisters. At the same time, his godmother, Tsunade, was always chatting with his sisters whenever she was visiting, helping to patch them up whenever their training got out of hand, leading to a strong connection between all of them. But whenever she looked at Naruto, he would notice her eyes getting teary, before she turning from him, leaving him alone and confused in her wake. What he could not know was that Naruto looked so much like Tsunade's younger brother when he was growing up that Tsunade could not look at him without remembering her brother's death. So instead of facing her fear head-on, she simply chose to avoid Naruto. While she did not dislike the boy, she simply told herself that he had others to look after him. So slowly Naruto became more and more excluded from his family. While his sisters still played with him occasionally, they had begun to incorporate training into their games, playing ninja running, and the like that he could simply not keep up with. But as always, he insisted that they go on ahead, not wanting to make them feel bad about their abilities. Despite everything happening to his life, Naruto stayed the same kind boy he had always been. He smiled and laughed and did whatever he could to see his family smile. And that was no different today, almost a full year after his sisters had begun their training. The birthday was in full swing now, with people milling around. All of the clan heads in attendance to offer their congratulations to Mito turning 1. Speaking of Mito, she was sitting happily, in a bright white onesie with an Uzumaki spiral adorning it on the back, between the feet of her older brother, while giggling as they played with her. As Mito sat laughing as she rolled around under her brother's gaze as it trailed to the yard where Naruto and Minami were off playing with a few of the clan heirs, while Minato and Kushina were talking with their parents and discussing the upcoming year at the academy, where many of their children would be attending. As Naruto continued to play with his red-haired Imoto, he heard a quiet voice call out to him from behind. Turning, his mixed eyes fell upon bluish hair and white eyes of his best friend, Hinata Hyuga. The two had only known each other for a few months, but already they were almost inseparable thanks to an event back when they had first met, where he had stepped up to protect her against some bullies at the park. Flashback. Naruto had been walking through the park wondering what to do while his sisters were off playing shinobi tag, when he heard the sound of raised voices from behind a clump of trees a bit off the trail. Curious, Naruto headed towards the voices. Upon arriving, he had found Hinata in a circle of boys, all making fun of her, and pushing her to the ground. "Hey, leave her alone," shouted Naruto, running up to stand between the bullies and Hinata, the girl's eyes still moist with tears, looking up to see the blonde-haired boy standing before her. As he came slowly into focus, she suddenly remembered seeing him from afar when the Hokage had met with her father. Who's this kid?" asked one of the boys, looking at Naruto, as beside him his friends shook their heads, not having any idea. "I'm Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze, and I won't let you pick on her," shouted Naruto at the bullies, raising both his fists in front of him to make his point clear. The bullies stared at Naruto with varying looks of confusion, before one finally spoke. "Wait, I thought the Hokage only had 2 kids, the village princesses," muttered one, looking at his fellows who nodded at him. "Yeah, everyone knows that, you moron," said another, pointing at Naruto. "Let's teach him for lying about our Hokage, guys," shouted the last, as the boys fell upon Naruto. Hinata could only watch as her hero was attacked by the 3 boys, trying but failing to stand up to the onslaught of all 3. She was about to try and help him when a pair of yellow and red blurs crashed into the bullies, blowing them back off the small form that was Naruto. "Hey, which one of you wants to tell me why you are hurting my Onisan?" shouted the enraged form of Naruto, as she stood protectively in front of her brother, blonde hair wiping back as her blue eyes trailed across the stunned bullies. Never mind Naruto, it doesn't matter what they say, they're still getting a butt kicking for hurting out Onisan. Called Minima, cracking both her knuckles like her godmother often did, whenever their godfather did something perverted, the three boys shivering as the pair advanced on them. Before the three boys could do more than cry out in fear, the girls were upon them, returning each punch tenfold for having hurt their brother. During this commotion, Naruto had slowly gotten up, and looked around to find Hinata looking worriedly towards him, her eyes still moist with tears. Smiling at her, Naruto half dragging himself over till he was beside her, looking her over with an obvious amount of concern. "Hey, are you okay? They didn't hurt you, did they?" asked Naruto once he got close enough to see Hinata clearly. Hinata in turn simply nodded slightly as her mind raced, trying to figure out who this boy was before her. "Wait, I thought the Hokage only had 2 girls, but they just said he was their brother, so wait, does that mean the Hokage's son just saved me?" she thought in a rush, even as a red blush began to creep over her face as Naruto leaned in looking concerned. "Hey bro, you okay?" came the call of Naruto, who had just finished giving the world's worst weggy to one of his would-be attackers. Turning at her call, Naruto found himself smiling at the sight of the 3 bullies now tearing across the clearing, all crying as his sisters stood triumphantly before him. "Oh course Datbeo, I'm fine, those guys couldn't beat me if they tried," he said, trying not to show that he was actually pretty hurt. "Onisan, what are we going to do with you?" sighed Minami as she approached, shaking her head slightly. "You're not strong enough to protect yourself yet, try thinking before you act," she finished, looking a little sad at lecturing the boy for getting himself hurt. "I'm too strong, I'm going to be stronger than both of you, just wait till we get into the academy and you'll see," Naruto replied, standing up and thrusting his fist into the air. "Baka," Minami said while putting her hand over her face. She knew her brother wanted to be strong, but the fact remained that he was only going to get himself hurt if he kept on going the way he was. She was also getting more and more annoyed with how he seemed unwilling to realize it. Why doesn't Onisan see how far behind he is? I mean, he just keeps saying that Kasan and Tusen will train him soon, and he'll show us then. Onisan has to learn how things work or he's going to get himself hurt, she thought, as beside her Naruto had other ideas. "Ha! No way bro, I'm going to be the best ever, and become Hokage. You don't need to worry, I'll always be here to protect my baby brother. And then I'll train you too, but only if you ask nicely," laughed Naruto as she smiled at her brother. Naruto responded to her jab by sticking his tongue out and telling her that he would be better than her in no time, and the two degraded into a small friendly argument while Hinata and Minami watched on. Flashback end. After that, Naruto had gotten to know Hinata slowly, the two becoming fast friends, playing when they could, and generally just enjoying each other's company. Each also learning the similarity they shared in their family. Like Naruto, Hinata seemed to have been slowly pushed away after the birth of her younger brother a little over a year back. The little boy Hanabi having become the center of attention within the Hyuga household, happy that he had emerged despite the worry surrounding the boy's Kasan. Their mother had been sick for several months while carrying little Hanabi, but thanks to the presence of Tsunade she had pulled through, though the events surrounding the birth still resulted in her being bound to a wheelchair for the rest of her life. This on top of the new child severely hampered Hitomi's ability to look after her daughter, but if nothing else the Hyuga woman was stubborn to a fault and did what she could for her daughter, even if it was just the two sitting in compound's gardens together. Hinata's father, however, was a bit of a different story. He had latched onto his son and had become more and more attentive to him, bragging about how he was going to raise him to be the greatest gentle fist user, even better than his brother's son Neji. Unfortunately for Hinata, she was born into a family where power and skill seemed destined to decide one's fate, the competition slowly growing throughout her family, making for a hard place for the innocent girl. But for now she was free from that as she smiled across at her friend and his Imoto. "Hello Naruto-kun," whispered Hinata as she approached the pair of namakazes, guiding her Ototo Hanabi as she did so. While Hinata took after her mother, Hanabi was a little Hiyashi in every regard, and walked with a sense of pride that made him an odd sight, only being 1 year old himself. His stoic mask broke, however, when the little red-headed Mito walked over to him, smiling wildly into his stoic face. Before the little Hyuga could do more than look at this smiling redhead, Mito let out a happy giggle before throwing her blanket towards the boy's head, intent to drape him in it. Hanabi, seeing the blanket approach, tried to perform the spinning move he had seen Hyuga do to deflect things from hitting them, but sadly not understanding that only twirling wasn't going to save him, as the blanket fell over him, winding its way around him, so that he soon found himself wrapped up and on the floor, looking up at a giggling redhead who dropped down to start pushing playfully at the trapped boy. While the two 1-year-old had been having their tiff, Naruto and Hinata had begun talking about the academy, hoping they would both be in the same class when it started. And so on. This continued throughout the evening until at long last the guests had left and only the Namikaze family remained. As they parents tucked each of their children in for the night, Naruto sat waiting in bed for the chance to ask his parents the question that he had been waiting a full year to ask. When the two came in to wish him good night, they found Naruto bouncing up and down on the bed in restless excitement. "Now what has got you so excited?" asked Kushina, smiling down at her son as Naruto's excited eyes turned to her. "Well, Kasan, now that Mito is 1, does that mean I can join the training now, can I?" asked Naruto with stars in his eyes as he looked between his parents. At his question, Kushina felt a slight pang of guilt as she looked down at the smiling face of her son. She had only recently been able to get back up and start to help the girls with their training, and despite their improvement, they were still not where both Minato and she wanted them to be before Naruto joined them. With Mito finally becoming old enough to not need her complete attention, she had hoped to move towards training the girls on a more hands-on approach to finish things up. Meanwhile, beside her, Minato was biting back his own guilt as flashes a choice he made assaulted him like so many hammering blows. He still had to help his girls prepare for the job they would have in the future. He knew that, and for that he also knew what he would have to sacrifice. But he had to make sure they were ready if everything he cared about was to be protected. Besides, I went through the academy without help, so did Sensei. It's not like I'm leaving him to the wolves, and there will be time later, yeah, later. Thought the man as he shook himself back to reality, looked down at his son. Well, spoke Minato, drawing Naruto's attention to him, I think it would be best for you to start up in your academy studies before we start your training, son. Spoke Minato as Kushina looked to him a little worried. Who, but why? Asked Naruto, looking confused. Well, you see, son, the academy will be able to tell where you are good at, so that when you start with us, we will be able to teach you even faster, and we don't want you having trouble with both our training and the academy work, lied Minato, even as he felt the pang of guilt in knowing that he was misleading his child. But I thought I would get to be trained by you, whispered Naruto, looking sadly between his parents, feeling a horrible sinking feeling in his chest as the joy and excitement that had been building there tumbled away. You will, Sochi, we'll be training you in no time, but we need to make sure we don't rush things, said Kushina, feeling tears on the corners of her eyes even as she saw the confusion on her son's face, as she too threw in the white lie she hated herself for using. Naruto, for his part, looked back and forth between his parents, feeling a multitude of questions springing to life within his head. Why can't they train me? I mean, they love me, right? And they train Naruto and Minami. Why am I being left out? Hey, why does mom look sad? I hate it when she looks like that. Stupid Naruto, of course they love you. Look, they are sad you don't like them looking after you. Baka, quick smile, show them you're okay. Wait. Why, I mean, I am sad. Maybe they should feel bad. No, I won't let them be sad, Dadbeo. Thought Naruto as he pushed back his confusion, forcing a smile onto his lips. Okay, he said happily, causing both parents to relax slightly, but when I know what I'm good at, you better be ready, because I'm going to show you that I'm the greatest shinobi ever, Dadbeo. cried the boy, his words causing both parents to let out a breath at this, relieved that Naruto seemed to be taking the idea okay. Soon they finished tucking him in and left to look after Mito, before turning in themselves. As the pair moved down the hall towards their own room, Kushina found herself doubting her own actions as she turned to her husband. Minato, do you think this is okay? I mean, leaving Naruto out, he needs to be trained too, you know. Sure, I want to make sure the girls are okay, but lying to him like that, it's just wrong. Finished Kushina solemnly as she and him got ready for bed. I know, Kushina, but we need to make sure the girls are looked after first, and you are the only one who can safely train them. Neither of them are able to form your chains, so we need to be careful. I just don't want to see any of the hurt. Sometimes we have to tell a white light to protect them, but we'll never stop loving him, Kushina, and we'll make it up to him, I promise. Minato replied softly, silently trying to convince himself even though he knew he was only telling half-truths. I guess, we'll start his training up next year, and then we'll make him an amazing shinobi, right? Kushina responded with an almost pleading note to her voice. We'll make it up to him, Kushina, I promise. Replied Minato as he laid down to sleep beside his wife, feeling as though his mind would tear itself apart for what he was doing. Meanwhile, down the hall, Naruto was having more problems falling to sleep as well. His mind continued to fire off contradictory arguments about his parents' behavior. Why don't they train me with my sisters? Is it my fault? No, I haven't done anything. What should do? I want to be strong enough to protect them. No, they are both awesome shinobi, they have to have reason for what they're doing, right? He continued to ask himself, desperate for some kind of answer. Will you stop that? I'm trying to sleep here, shouted a feminine voice from seemingly all around the room as Naruto froze, wondering for a moment if his silent pleading had been answered. Naruto looked wildly around in an attempt to see where it was coming from, only seeing the shadowed shapes of his room before him. Who said that? He shouted, still looking around his room, starting to get a little frightened as he continued to see no one that could have spoken to him. Learn some manners and I might just tell you, you little seedling. Replied the voice once again, seemingly coming from nowhere. With nothing else for it, Naruto decided to answer the voice. Okay, mister. That's Ems, the voice interrupted. Sorry, Ms., but where are you and why can't I see you? Asked Naruto, wondering what was going on. Am I going crazy? You see, this is what you get for being stupid. Kami is making you hear voices. He thought to himself before he was interrupted from his mental berating by the sound of laughter. Kami, he haha. Oh, that's good, me Kami, that's priceless, I wouldn't be caught dead looking after the universe, too much work. Chuckled the voice, slowly petering out into a small fit of giggles. Wait, how did you hear me? Where are you? Asked Naruto again, searching for the source of the voice, this time looking under his bed as if he expected to see someone hiding under it. You can stop looking for me, little seedling, I'm not in your room, I'm in your head, the voice stated as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. This caused Naruto to stop dead in his search, and look across to his wall where a mirror hung, as if expecting to see another face reflected upon it. What do you want with my head? What's going on? Who are you, Ms.? What do you want? Asked Naruto, firing off questions one after another. Relax already, you're going to give yourself a heart attack, I swear you little seedlings are all the same. To answer your question, I suppose you can just call me Kyuubi, and what I want is to make a deal with you. Spoke the voice as Naruto continued to stare into the mirror. A life forgotten. What do you want with my head? What's going on? Who are you, Ms.? What do you want? Naruto called, firing question after question out with hardly a pause between them. Relax already, you're going to give yourself a heart attack, I swear you little seedlings are all the same. Sighed the voice as she waited for the boy, who seemed to have finally run out of steam, to quiet down. As he finally fell silent, the voice spoke out again, echoing in the empty room. To answer your question, I suppose you can just call me Kyuubi, and what I want is to make a deal with you. Continued the voice as Naruto looked across the room into the mirror that showed his own puzzled face. Kyuubi, muttered Naruto, quirking one eyebrow up as he spoke, a little surprised by the word. Well, that's a weird name, he thought to himself as he crossed his arms in thought. I will have you know it is not a weird name, young seedling, and it is not polite to insult someone who can make your head explode from the inside out, the Kyuubi replied with an air that only an irritated woman could pull off. Ah! Shouted Naruto a moment before rolling off of his bed, both hands now clapped to either side of his head as he thumped to the wooden floor, where he proceeded to roll back and forth in apparent panic. No, Ms. Kyuubi, don't blow up my head. Please, Ms. Pretty Beautiful, kind loving Kyuubi, you wouldn't do that to me, would you? Please, begged Naruto as he rolled to a halt, looking into the mirror with rivers spilling from both of his eyes as he clapped his hands before him as though in prayer. PFFT, oh, this is priceless, you're great, I can't wait to see what else I can make you do. Calmed the amused voice of Kyuubi from seemingly everywhere in the room. Oh, this was so much better than being stuck in the moon, thought the voice, at least here she could have fun messing with humans again. After finally getting her amused giggles under control, Kyuubi turned her attention back out to her host, noticing as she did that he had fallen silent once more. Hey little seedling, you still alive out there? Asked the Kyuubi as she once again looked out through the boy's eyes to see his face now turned from fear into a childish pout that was looking back at him from his own re-election. Odd, does the little seedling not like being picked on by the big bad Kyuubi? She laughed, looking at the cute pouting form of Naruto, who had brought his arms up folded before him as he looked pointedly away from his reflection as if trying to ignore the voice. That wasn't funny, muttered the boy, still refusing to look at his own reflection as if that was who he was conversing with. Oh, on the contrary, I think it was quite funny, replied the Kyuubi, waiting a few moments for a response from the boy, who seemed quite set on ignoring her. So do you want to know what my deal is, or do you want to sit pouting on your floor all night? Because I can wait a lot longer than you, seedling. Chuckled the Kyuubi as she saw the boy glancing back to his reflection, a thoughtful expression upon his young face as he slowly let his arms fall to his sides. I guess, mumbled the boy, finally turning to face the mirror again, even if he was only facing his reflection. Ms. Kyuubi, is there a way that I can see you? It's kinda weird talking to myself. Called the boy as he gave his reflection another glance. The boy's remark seemed to trigger something within the woman as her own thoughts turned back to a time when her only companion had been her voice, and how that long loneliness had come to an end so many years ago. Flashback. The disembodied consciousness of Kyuubi was silently flouting within her lunar prison, her thoughts cast out once more to how she had managed to let some stupid women steal her charge, and worse, let that same women's children seal her away after robbing her of her power and children in one fell swoop. As her thoughts began to swirl, the agitation became too much as she called out into the starry night. Ah, if I ever see that woman and her sons again, I'll seal them in this stupid rock and see how they like it. Screamed Kyuubi into the silence of the moon that she called home. It had been thousands of years since that stupid sage had sealed her into this lunar prison, and with only her thoughts to keep her company, the time had passed very slowly indeed. Her only reprieve had been when on a full moon's night she could cast her gaze down at the world, these brief glimpses being all that kept her from falling to absolute despair within her celestial tome. So tonight, like those before, she turned her gaze upon the earth, not knowing that this moment would spell that end to her long exile. As her eyes slowly shifted down, her attention was immediately drawn to a commotion within a forested land. As she looked closer, she saw her youngest son causing his usual 9 kinds of hell for the people of a shinobi village. As she watched her son swiped his tails back and forth across the armies of the village, his mouth open in a roar of rage, but something was wrong. That rage, it wasn't his. As she watched the great kitsune raging among the trees, she saw his almost rabid assault upon the village that sat burning beneath him, her eyes narrowing as she saw his eyes momentarily turn skyward, his eyes sporting a horribly familiar red marking. Her memories recalled the only other time she had seen her son like this, all those years ago in that valley as he stood between the descendants of that stupid woman, used as a pawn in their petty battles for power. As her memories fell into place beside the V-zone before her, an uncontrollable rage boiled up within her. Damn them, she yelled as she struggled hopelessly against her prison walls. It's not enough that they bind me here, but they have to continue to use my children in their stupid war, cried the woman as she looked down at her son's body paraded like a puppet to that family's tune. Leave him alone, you bastards. When I get out of here, I swear I'm going to tear them limb from limb and scatter their ashes to the four winds so even Cammy can't put their bodies back together. Let him go, screamed the Kyuubi as below her son continued to rage. Even as she howled and struggled, her eyes noticed as an older figure charged along to attack her son. Unable to tear her eyes away, she watched the battle begin, the shinobi throwing everything he had in an attempt to halt her son's assault on the village. As the struggled, her eyes turned to a small ceiling table which appeared behind the man, her attention now drawn to the three small bundles that lay upon it. Turning her attention back to the battle, she watched as one of the attacking figures split from the fight, turning to run towards the table, as the seals around it began to glow, illuminating the night sky around it. Then he appeared, the one she had long ago known, the brother of her lord, the lord she had failed so long ago. No, it can't be, whispered Kyuubi, her tone speaking of the disbelief currently running through her as she gazed upon the figure who had emerged from behind the old shinobi. But there he was, the Shinigami himself, in all of his terrible glory, his hollowed mask looking down across the bundles before him before turning to look up upon the great kitsune. Then before she could overcome her shock, she was forced to watch as his hands reached out to tear her child apart. She watched helplessly as the hands tore the yin and yang from her son, his roars of pain flooding the night sky as her own rang out in the heavens above. And still all she could do was watch as the Shinigami's hands dragged the two halves into the children, sealing her son once again into a living prison. As the scene slowly came to an end, Kyuubi found herself openly weeping at the sight of her son's fate. The 9 may have never been her chosen children, but they were born from her, and like any mother, she could no more bear their suffering than her own. As the final flickers of her son began to fail, Kyuubi found herself turning from the surface, not wishing to see any more, not able to bear to see her children suffer as she sat helplessly above them. Then, just as her eyes slowly turned away from the lands below, a gentle pressure caught her, as though a hand had reached up to halt her from looking away. As she turned towards that feeling, her eyes found themselves moving down towards the table beside which the Shinigami still stood, looking up towards the moon right into her eyes. As the pair's eyes meet, the Shinigami slowly inclining its head towards the final bundle upon the table. Watching, Kyuubi saw the skeletal hand of the figure moving to trace a small seal upon the boy's brow, her symbol, as he looked back to her as if to tell her that it was waiting. For a moment she was unable to even believe that this was happening. Had Cammy finally heard her prayers? After all of these years, was she finally being given a second chance, a place outside of this moon prison to once again live in, a chance for freedom? The Shinigami once again shifted his head, motioning for the Kyuubi to move towards the bundle even as its form began to fade. As the ghostly figure slowly began to dissipate, she shook herself from her thoughts as she looked back to the disappearing figures, her lips parting as a choked voice issued out. "Thank you," she whispered as she allowed the pull from the ceiling table to draw her down towards the final struggling bundle. And so, as her soul had finally been freed from her lunar prison, finally back to the world she had so long been apart from. And so she found herself slipping gently into the final struggling babe who lay beside his siblings, a small look of peace crossing his face as the seal upon his head glowed faintly before fading. Flashback end. As Jubi shook herself from her memories, her attention returned to the small blonde still looking curiously at his reflection as she felt a small smile crossing her lips. Well, since you asked nicely, I guess we can meet face to face, spoke Jubi as she considered how to go about handling the situation before her. Tell me, boy, do you know what a mindscape is? Asked the woman's voice after a moment as she watched the boy blinking at her words. Naruto in reply, his head to one side at the question, moving to recross his arms in what passed for a 6-year-old's thinking pose. For a full minute the blonde sat there, his eyes closed in apparent concentration as Jubi waited silently, starting to wonder if the boy had slipped back to sleep on her. After a little longer, Naruto suddenly opened his eyes with a look of confidence on his face as he spoke. Nope, no idea, he called as a wide grin found itself spreading across his face. For a moment Jubi simply looked at the boy's smile before letting out a sigh as she shook her head. You know, that's not something you should be particularly proud of, seedling, pointed out the woman as Naruto's smile faded, replaced with an annoyed look. Hey, it's not my fault. If you're so smart, why don't you tell me what it is, Dadbayo? Naruto fired back as Jubi's face quirked up into a smirk the boy could not see. What did I say about asking nicely? Jubi whispered in a dangerously sweet voice that caused Naruto to freeze, his mixed eyes to go wide as he shifted back into his pleading look, complete with clasped hands. I mean, please tell me smart, pretty, nice Ms. Jubi, gushed Naruto with a hint of panic as he looked to his own reflection, hoping his head wouldn't explode any moment. Nice to see you remember. Oh, and drop the Ms., but the pretty you can leave, chuckled Jubi as she focused on drawing the boy into his mindscape. Now just relax, I'll help you in this time so you can get a feel for it, she called as her presence reached forwards towards the boy's own. Even as the final words echoed within the boy's mind, he felt a tug on the back of his neck as darkness slowly closed in from the outsides of his vision. At first the sudden blackness terrified the young boy as it slowly crept across his eyes, swallowing him whole. However, just as the last vestiges of light disappeared, his eyes were suddenly assaulted with a blinding flash that caused him to raise his hands before his face as an impromptu shield. A moment later, as the light slowly faded, Naruto lowered his arms, allowing his eyes gaze around at his new surroundings. Where before, he would have seen the simple plaster walls of his room, with its usual amount of mess, he instead saw a massive expanse of blue and green stretching out to the horizon. A moment before he had been sitting in his room on the second floor of his home, but now found himself in an open field, the soft green grass now all around him brushing lightly against his bare feet. As he turned his eyes skyward, he saw a cloudless blue sky that seemed to stretch on for miles in every direction, on and on, as if this land had no true end to it. Feeling the touch of the green ground below him, Naruto's eyes fell across his orange pajamade from to the grass on hand, running gently through it as he pushed himself up from the ground, his mind already buzzing with questions. Where am I? Last thing I remember was something about mindscape, and that voice saying something about helping me. Was I dreaming? Wait, no, is this that mindscapey thing? But this just looks like some field like the ones outside the village. Maybe that's all that happened, I just fell asleep in the field. Though the boy as he continued to take in his surroundings. However, before he could continue to try and explain how he had found himself in this deserted field, a voice jerked him back to reality. Well, are you going to sit there all day, or are you going to say hello, seedling? Things may pass slowly here, but you don't strike me as the patient type, called the voice, now coming from behind the blonde instead of from his own mind. At the call, Naruto spun towards the source of the voice, his eyes traveling across the plain to the peak of a large hill he suddenly realized he was standing at the base of. Looking up the hill, the blonde's eyes were immediately drawn to the summit where a single magnificent tree stood. The tree stretched some 40 feet into the air, and had bark of pale white, as though the clouds absent in the blue skies had been formed to create its massive trunk. As the boy's eyes trailed up the great tree, his eyes found an explosion of color awaiting him as the thousands of gently swaying leaves formed a great canopy above him, each of the leaves shining with a deep purple light or shifting to an odd glowing black as thought the leaves themselves had not chosen what color to remain. The tree seemed the center of this place, as though the blue skies and grass themselves were given light from its branches. Slowly Naruto began to approach the top of the hill, feeling an odd pull to reach the beautiful thing. As he continued to get closer, he felt a strange peace about him, as though he was greeting an old friend that he hadn't seen in a great while. Soon he reached the summit and stood before the tree, a rather disconcerting thought popping into his head as he looked up at the massive tree. Great! I'm talking to a giant purple tree. Oh, that's just great. This is what I get for eating all that ramen. Minami was right, it's rotted my brain. Stupid delicious ramen, thought the boy as he extended one hand towards the bark of the tree, curious to see if it felt as soft as it looked. I wouldn't do that if I were you, little seedling. At least not until we have our talk. Oh, and I'm not just some talking tree, called the familiar voice now coming from directly above the boy. The sudden voice caught Naruto off guard as he jumped slightly back from the tree, looking back and forth for the source of the voice before a small giggle drew his attention up into the softly shifting purple canopy. That's right, I'm up here, seedling, called the voice once again, a small smile almost visible in the words alone. Looking up, Naruto's eyes fell upon the outline of a figure he could barely see against the tree, his eyes squinting to get a better look. As if in answer to his desire, the figure began to descend slowly from above one of the branches, bending to accommodate its passenger as the pair moved steadily towards the blond boy. As the branch came closer, the figure sitting upon it slowly came into clearer focus. She sat gracefully upon the branch, one hand draped lightly over her lap while the other held the side of her living transport figures draped lightly over the silken branch. Her hair was the same shade of purple as the leaves of the tree and seemed to glow with the same simple radiance as the tree as it fell about her shoulders, waving gently as she gazed down upon the boy. Her skin was porcelain white like the bark of the tree itself, covered in a simple kimono that lay upon her, adorned with the pattern that mirrored the falling of leaves. Despite the simplicity of the dress, it somehow seemed to only intensify her beauty as it curved gracefully around her form, accenting her beauty and strength in equal proportions. However, despite this staggering image, what drew Naruto's focus was the woman's face. The gentile heart-shaped curved set between the waves of her purple hair turned towards him as a smile played across her lips. But even this was not where the boy's gaze sat. His gaze fell only upon her eyes, her unearthly eyes. They glowed pure black, as though one were looking into a night sky that had yet to give forth any stars. Yet they were somehow welcoming, like some great expanse that was begging to be explored, the warm glow seeking to embrace one just as night would come to embrace day in the endless dance of the heavens. Well, my little seedling, what do you think? Not too bad for a woman that has been trapped in the moon for the last 1,000 years. Called Kyuubi, as the branch finished its descent, settling before Naruto as Kyuubi rose slowly from it, her bare feet alighting upon the grass as she looked down at the boy who now came only to her waist. Wow! Whispered Naruto as he looked at this woman, lost for words at the woman who had literally just descended from on high. All he could do was look at her in silence for a few moments as he took in her image, noticing the small smile upon her lips growing into a slightly amused expression as her eyes crinkled near their edges. I know I'm amazing, seedling, but if you're just going to stare at me all night, then I'm afraid we won't get much accomplished. Giggled Kyuubi as she brought one of her hands up to push a few stands from before her face as Naruto seemed to shake himself out of his stupor. Sorry, it's just I've never seen anyone with eyes like that before, said Naruto, looking down at his feet in an attempt to hide the blush at being caught just staring at the beautiful woman. I suppose you haven't. At that, no one has seen my eyes since Kami himself sent me down to your world to guard his fruit upon my branches. Well, that stupid woman and her son saw them too, but I don't like to count them. Remarked Kyuubi as she adopting a simple thinking position, one hand raised to tap ideally at her smooth chin. Who? Asked Naruto, turning his head on his side and once again adopting a confused expression as he looked at the woman before him. Fruit? Kami, what are you talking about, pretty Kyuubi? Asked Naruto, remembering to add the little tick to the woman's name, drawing a small smile to her lips as she looked down at him. I guess I'm laying a bit too much on you at the moment. This is our first meeting after all. Let's start over, said Kyuubi as she bowed slightly, as a lady of the court might, her eyes never leaving the boy before her. My name is Josei no Jubi Suri, but you may call me Jubi. I am a warrior of the heavens, and have been imprisoned in the moons for the past 1,000 years. You may also know me as the mother to those you call the tailed beasts. Finished the woman as she rose, Naruto blinking up at her for a moment before rushing to bow as well. Oh right, well, I'm Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze, son of the 4th Hokage and soon-to-be greatest ninja of Konohagakure Dadbeo, he said, glancing up to Jubi, who reached out to pat his blonde head, slightly nodding down at him. Well, it's nice to finally meet you, Naruto. We'll have to work on your matters later, but for now let's get to why you're here, spoke the woman as she moved over to rest herself against the tree. Naruto soon moved after her, settling himself before her so that he was looking up into her face as she fixed him with those blackened eyes of her again. Josei no Jubi Sura, started Naruto as Jubi let out a small chuckle, waving him off. I told you, seedling, just Jubi, I never liked the whole title anyway, called the woman as Naruto nodded, smiling as he looked around himself again. Okay, up Jubi, where are we? Asked the blonde as Jubi looked around them at the open field with a small nod. Well, this is a place as in your mind, Naruto. Kind of like a room in your mind that I've organized to suit me, explained the Jubi. Seeing the confused look on Naruto's face, she continued. Think of it like a little vacation home. I just set up here. I can assure you that it won't harm you at all, smiled the woman as Naruto seemed to be satisfied with her words. Oh, okay then, replied Naruto a little loudly, a smile upon his face as he accepted the woman's words without a second thought. My Kami, this kid is so innocent it's almost scary. He'll have to realize at some point it's going to get him into a world of trouble. Though I suppose that is the problem that lead him here, isn't it? Thought Jubi as she let out a sigh, focusing back on the boy blinking up at her. Naruto, since I'm living in your head, I was thinking that I could do something for you. Like a way to pay you back for letting me say her. How would you like that? Asked the woman in an offhanded way that nonetheless caught Naruto's attention, as he seemed to vibrate slightly at the prospect. Really, what do I get? Is it a cool superpower, or the extra chakra like my sisters? You said you were the tailed beast's mom. Does that mean I'm a Jinchuriki like my sisters? Hey, does that mean that I'll get training from my parents now just like my sisters? Does it, Ms. Jubi? Naruto called, firing question after question in that way only an excited child could. There were many things that Jubi was prepared for. An excited 6-year-old, that was on the equivalent of a sugar high with the attention span of a gnat, was not one of them. While there, seedling, hold on for a moment, I can't answer you if you never stop asking, now can I? Asked Jubi with an exasperated shake of her head. This caused Naruto to slap both his hands over his mouth in an over-the-top manner as if to completely stop all sound from escaping from his mouth as he looked worriedly towards the woman. Better. She chuckled as she looked over the boy before nodding slightly as if deciding something. Now I guess I'll start with the question of chakra. I'm afraid that I don't really have any more chakra. You see, when a certain man, here she adopted an annoyed look, who we will just call Deadbeat, took my chakra from me. He used all of my power combined with my ability to give life to chakra in order to create the tailed beasts. So my power is in all of my children, like my youngest that is sealed into your sisters. Explained the purple-haired woman as Naruto gave her another puzzled look. Who but my sisters have the Kyuubi, the 9-tailed fox? Said Naruto, quirking his head to the side as he looked up into the woman's black eyes. Yep, that's my youngest, always trying to show he is the best of his siblings by flaunting his power. Silly little boy. She said more to herself than to the boy, shaking her head slightly as she spoke. Anyway, the point is that I'm afraid I don't have any chakra to give you. But you are still a Jinchuriki, just not like your sisters. She finished her words, causing the boy before her to deflate slightly at her words. For a moment Naruto felt the happiness that had slowly been growing within him faltered as his hopes of being like his sisters were dashed. That doesn't mean I can't do anything for you on the superpowers, though. Added Jubi, hoping to get the boy's spirits back up. The result worked a little better than she was hoping for, as it caused the blonde to leap up off the grass and start running around the tree, yelling about how cool it was. Before Jubi could even begin to call him back, he was already rounding the trunk, coming back to stand right in her face, blasting off questions once again. Really, that's awesome. What kind of powers? Will I be able to fly? That will be awesome. Or maybe I will be able to get some cool ability like a bloodline, like some of the clans. Tell me, Jubi, please, what is it? PPPPLLLLL. He asked, falling to his knees and looking at her with stars in her eyes, his little face showing so much excitement that Jubi found herself smiling despite her slightly annoyance at the boy's performance. Drawing in a deep breath, Jubi set her face into a stern look as she gazed across at the boy, who seemed to freeze at her gaze. Okay, Naruto, we can't keep doing this song and dance all night. If you want me to help, you will sit there and listen to what I have to say, or I can just let your head explode, stated the pale-skinned woman as Naruto froze before nodding hurriedly. Yes, Jubi-sensei, called Naruto, falling back and sitting excitedly before her, rocking slightly back and forth as he smiled up at her. Good. Now I'm afraid I don't have a magic wand to wave to give you superpowers, but what I can do is give you the training so that you can use my abilities with your own chakra, started the woman as Naruto nodded excitedly at her words. Now, before I get any farther, this would require you going through a long time of training, and it would require us to leave the village for a while, continued Jubi as Naruto blinked up at her. How long are we talking about? Asked the boy, watching as Jubi took a moment to think before replying. I would have to say at least 10 years to get the whole training done, but if you work hard, maybe just 8. What? 10 years? Are you crazy? I can't leave for 10 years. What about my family? My friends? What about my parents? They are going to start my training in a year. I can't just leave, shouted Naruto as he pushed himself to his feet, looking down at the woman who watched him, a small frown upon her lips. Poor boy, he is so worried about others that he is going to stunt his own growth just to make them feel better. And he's just stubborn enough not to care. Gah, what am I going to do now? Thought the woman, even as Naruto crossed his arm, fixing her with a determined look. I'm not leaving my family. My Tusen and Kasen are going to train me to be an amazing shinobi, and then I'll protect everyone, called Naruto as Jubi fixed him with a sad look upon her brow. Naruto, if you keep waiting for everything to work out, you're going to end up left behind, and me along with you. I'm trying to help you, but you need to be selfish this once, replied Jubi, fighting to keep her own voice steady as she slowly rose to her feet so that she towered over Naruto, who looked stubbornly back at her. So what do you care? They are my family. They care and love me. What makes you think you know what's better for me than them? Called Naruto, now feeling slightly scared as his own worried found themselves now being directed towards the woman before him. It's not a matter of love, Yubaka. You want to be a shinobi, well, you need to be ready. I have seen hundreds of kids like you go out to save everyone and only end up losing their own life as a result. She called, flashes of her own battles rushing through her mind as she recalled those times such ideals had led her to fail in her mission, to caring to sacrifice the innocent to capture that hated woman. I can't. Jubi whispered as the fight left her, allowing her to slowly slip back to her sitting position, looking sadly up at Naruto, her lifetime alone crashing upon her as she gazed at another who risked the same suffering. I can't let you sacrifice yourself for them. I can't watch helpless while those I have come to care about are taken from me, continued the woman as Naruto's anger left him as he watched the woman seemingly shrink before him as her voice grew softer, more pained with every moment. I was just like you, all good intentions, and I lost my children to good intentions. I lost my freedom to good intentions. I am not prepared to see you lose everything I did, seedling. I can't live those seeing that again. She finished, turning her moist eyes towards the boy. Naruto looked again into those bright black eyes with the starlight tears that were falling from them as his own doubts surfaced. He hated to have these thoughts, and worse, he hated to see someone so sad. So he did the only thing he could think of. He stepped forward and embraced her, letting his smaller form to be pulled close to her as she openly wept into his shoulder. It took a few moments for Jubi to regain her composure, and a little longer for Naruto to step back and allow her to right herself, rising to sit upon her branch once more, the small moist trails upon her cheeks still staining her beautiful face. I'm sorry I made you cry, Jubi. whispered the boy looking into her face as he saw Kyuubi shaking her head slightly. No, no Naruto, I'm sorry. I guess you are just like me after all, a couple of bakas. Smiled Kyuubi slightly as Naruto gave a small nod. Hi, two of a kind. Smiled Naruto, remembering one of the few phrases he had picked up from his godmother over the years. At his words, Kyuubi suddenly froze as her face slowly shifted into a smile as she looked back to the blonde boy before her. Well, maybe you aren't a baka after all, seedlings. I think you might have given me an idea how we can both win, she finished as Naruto gave her a puzzled look as she began to explain her plan to him. That night a decision was made that would rock the foundations of the shinobi world to their core, and from the hope of two bakas the world itself would find itself forever changed. Time skip. 2 years after that fateful night within a simple classroom within the Shinobi Academy, a group of potential shinobi and kunoichi sat listening with varying amounts of attention to the words of a man who stood before them marking off notes on a wide blackboard. However, most were too distracted to listen as an odd little mantra permeated the entire classroom, drawing several eyes as the steady beat continued. Board, thud, board thud, board thud, board thud, board thud. Continued the steady beat, drawing more and more eyes as it continued. The source of this mantra being a particular orange-clad, blonde-haired boy who sat in the back of the room where he was banging his head against his desk while droning on and on like some broken metronome. Already his seemingly continuous banging had attracted the attention of a large majority of the class and even He-chunin instructor himself. "Ga, is that baka ever going to stop? He is messing up the lesson again," thought a pink-haired girl looking back towards the front of the room as she tried to focus on the lesson. Hua. Oh, just Naruto again, zzzzzzzzz. Thought a particularly lazy individual before returning to his sleep, deciding that whatever the blonde had planned, it was too troublesome to worry about at the moment. Wonder what mom packed for lunch, maybe it's those pork buns again. Though a particularly good-natured boy who sat beside his sleeping friend, his hands ideally rubbing his protruding stomach as he continued to worry about lunch. Maybe if I show I'm strong like Itachi-ne-san, I won't have to sit through these lessons anymore. If he doesn't stop that pounding, Hokage's son or not, I'm going to hit him with my fireball. Thought a black-haired boy, who had a desperate urge to prove himself to everyone, his eyes narrowing back towards the titular blonde. I swear if he doesn't stop that pounding, I'm going to hop in his head, and make him run around town in a dress. Schemed a blonde-haired girl within her mind from where she sat beside her pink-haired friend. Maybe mom will let me bring Akamaru next time, at least then I will have something to do during these classes. Naruto's right, this is so boring. Thought a feral-looking boy as he ideally scratched at one red-fanged cheek. Beeboos, yes, Beeboos buzz. Yes, I know, buzz buzz buzz, don't worry, I'll be ready for it. A heavily clocked boy whispered as he continued to silently converse with the insects inside of his body. Haha, Oni-chan always does know how to sum up sensei's history lessons. Silently giggled Naruto, her hand moving up to cup over her mouth as she smiled around at her sister, who seemed less amused about the situation. Baka Oni-chan, if you don't pay attention you are never going to get any stronger. Thought an exasperated Minami, who shot her older sibling an annoyed look. Naruto-kun, you need to start listening or you aren't going to be able to pass. I'll have to talk to him later, even if he is right about Iruka-sensei's lectures. Thought Hinata as she looked at the blonde sitting to her left, her young face a mix of disapproval and amusement at her friend's actions. Board thud, board thud, board thud, ah! Shouted Naruto as he suddenly burst into movement, leaping onto the top of his desk and as he slammed both his hands down into the baggy pockets of his orange jumpsuit. Every person in the class except for one particular sleeper now turned their attention towards the boy as he made his declaration. Boredom must die. Die, I say, death to boredom. roared the blonde as his hands re-emerged from his pockets, an almost manic smile now plastered across his face. As everyone's eyes saw that smile, a feeling of dread fell over them so that they almost failed to notice the two bright orange objects that Naruto had grasped in his hands. A split second later, both objects were loosed into the middle of the room, followed by a loud bang, and an ensuing river of orange in every direction. A moment after the blast, the whole classroom found itself dripping in orange paint, save for a few interesting exceptions. While most of the class had reacted by diving under their desks, at the sight of the orange projectiles, or in the case of one red head pulled under by her sister, there were two exceptions. The first being Iruka, who had been heading up the stairs towards the blonde at the time, and as a result was at ground zero, making him look as though he had stepped on an orange landmine, his whole form now dripping in a blanket of neon paint. The other victim was one, no longer sleeping, individual who was now plastered against the back wall of the classroom, slowly slipping down the wall even as he muttered to himself something about troublesome blondes. "Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze!" shouted Iruka as he cleaned the paint from his eyes and cast his gaze around the room. However, Naruto was nowhere to be seen, only an open window and the distant sound of laughter to mark his escape. "Naruto!" bellowed Iruka as he leapt out of the window after the blonde, the pair soon hurtling into the village as the remainder of the students watched them go. "What the heck? Why does he do stuff like this?" roared Sakura as she attempted to shake the orange paint from her book's casing, annoyed looks around the destroyed classroom. "Yeah, I mean, why can't he be more like you, Minami? Even Naruto never causes this kind of trouble," added Ino, looking across to where the sisters were emerging from below their desk. "Hey, what is that supposed to mean, Ino?" fired off Naruto as Minami let out a sigh, shaking her head towards her sister.